She moved through the lobby like someone apologizing for taking up space. Ruth Ellison's cart whispered across the marble floor. The basket of rags and a thermos of tea sat like quiet companions. Her hands were the kind that remembered seams and scuffed edges. The knuckles were freckled with old calluses, and the faint pale scars a lifetime of mending had left. She kept her head down more than most, as if lowering it could make her smaller, invisible. An economy of motion she learned long ago and practiced every day. The lobby of Carter Labs was all cool surfaces and steady order. The polished reception desk, where a woman in a navy suit kept her face like a shield, the potted ficus with perfectly trimmed leaves, the glass doors that let in an exact rectangle of afternoon light. Executives flowed through it like a current. The building had rules, and the rules were designed to keep trouble at the edges. Visitors channeled to the reception, deliveries through a back entrance, emotions quarantined to private offices. It was a place that rewarded sheen. Behind a pillar, pressed against cold stone, a small figure had already learned how to be unseen. Lily Carter fit into the shadow as if the pillar had been built her size. She hugged her knees. Her hair had been braided this morning into 2 uneven plaits, one of them undone and tangled. Her face was a small pale island of concentration where tears gathered and did not fall, a practice she had made into a habit. Her sketchbook lay open on her lap, a smudged witness. The drawings were full of houses without doors, windows like blank eyes. It was how she spoke now, in pictures that stopped short of asking. Ruth noticed the way the child's shoulders trembled when she shifted, noticed the thumb that kept tracing the same tiny circle on the page. That was how she saw things, the small, repeatable movements other people called meaningless. She did not clock them like a manager ticking boxes. She felt them like a teacher, feeling the rhythm of a restless classroom and knowing which child needed a whisper. She set her cart just a few feet from the pillar and sat down on her heels. It was a posture she had learned in church pews and in classrooms when knees could be the bridge to another person's eyes. Her movement made a small sound, cloth against marble, and Lily startled as if the noise had been a stranger. "Are you lost?" Ruth asked, and her voice did not carry the echo of the lobby's authority. It was patient, uninsisting, the kind of voice that suggested there might be time for whatever the child needed to give. Lily said nothing. Her mouth was a flat line. She glanced sideways, measuring the stranger. Ruth reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, threadbare bear. It was a hand-sewn thing, seams showing, one button eye replaced with a different-colored button. The other eye had been restitched so often that the thread had become a pattern. Ruth had carried that bear for years, her own small map of a life that had once been less steady. She had no right to offer it, and perhaps that made the offering truer. Nothing checked its value, nothing signed it off, no authority stamped it sacred. She placed the bear on the marble. The cold made the fabric stand out. The lobby's light turned the bear and Lily's face into a kind of portrait. Lily looked down at the bear like someone discovering an old acquaintance. For a long moment she simply stared. Then, with a hand that trembled in the way children's hands did when they were learning to trust sensation again, she reached out and touched the fabric. Ruth did not try to speak the language of experts. She did not offer diagnoses or techniques. She told a small story, the kind that had once come to her easily in classrooms at the end of a long week, about a little bottle cap that wanted to be a moon. She rolled the cap between her fingers and made it orbit an imaginary planet. The cap was flat and ordinary. In the story, it aspired to be round and glorious. As she spoke, she watched Lily's fingers mimic the motion, guessing the arc as if tracing the path of something returning. The first day did not feel heroic. It felt like the hush of 2 people discovering they could share the same breath. Lily whispered a single word, "Cap," and folded the bear into her arms. When Ruth packed up her cart and went back to the outer run of the lobby, she felt like someone who had closed a broken gate and left it loose for the future to find. Benjamin Carter watched a different world on a different plane. He watched the lobby from a glassed-in office 3 floors up, where the city looked flat and distant, like a model. On his desk lay a stack of quarterly reports, with margins fat from red ink, a laptop with an angry battery icon, and a photograph of a woman, his wife, taken 2 years earlier at a summer party. The picture had a light in it that sometimes made Benjamin forget the rest of the day. Benjamin loved order the way some men loved an instrument. He built companies like people built bridges, measured and steady. Money had been a tool, not a language that spoke for him. Yet there were things money could not wrap itself around. His daughter had stopped answering to words. Professionals had come and gone, consultants in sleek suits, a therapist who suggested structured exposure, a nanny who lasted a week. None of them could pull Lily out of the silence. They had tried charts and scripts and praise, all of it produced at best small, temporary noises that fell back into the pattern of quiet. That pattern widened like a shadow. Benjamin had watched the security feed more nights than he admitted. He had watched his daughter eat a cookie and not mention the taste. He had watched her get into a car and press her palms to the window, like someone feeling the surface of a world and not trusting what was beyond. He had watched therapists suggest escalating interventions, and he had watched his own fear, the fear of losing what he had left, make decisions quicker than his sense of fairness. When he saw the footage of a woman kneeling behind a pillar, offering a stuffed bear and telling a story about a bottle cap, he felt at once anomalously angry and strangely relieved. The rational parts of him noted policy concerns, adults interacting unsupervised with employees' children, potential liability, procedure. He was a man used to lists, but the hand that reached to bring his daughter's chin up a fraction of an inch did not seem to belong to the list. He froze the frame. The bear's button eye caught the light. He did not know Ruth's name. He did not expect to know her name. She was anonymous in everything that mattered to his company. The contract listed a cleaning firm. The invoices came from a third party. The woman herself left no trace, except the faint impression of a pair of shoes on a tile floor. Ruth kept coming. Afternoons became small rituals, the kind a child could map by taste and touch. The cafe manager, Marta, learned to pour a little extra milk when Lily's face needed the warmth. Marta's hands were always steady, and she took to wrapping sandwiches in paper with drawings of suns and moons, because someone had once taught her the way small pictures could anchor a person. The cleaning staff nodded in a way that was almost permission. They folded spare cloths into shapes that looked like fish and propped them where Lily liked to sit. The security guard, a man whose watch was scarred by years of opening the same doors, began to whistle an off-key tune when he saw Ruth coming. The building, which had once been a place of rigid edges, softened at the points where Ruth's cart hit the marble. Ruth's approach to Lily was never a program. It was a collection of decisions made from the muscle memory of a life that had taught her how to be present. She read the tiny gestures of a child, like someone reading a map. When Lily refused to look up during a week where the grief pressed close, Ruth would sit on the floor with a thermos and tell a story about a little boy who built boats from discarded menus. She would hum a lullaby that had once been sung to children in houses where curtains were thin and dishes clattered. She would show Lily how to fold a napkin into a bird. Each of these gestures was small, but accumulative. They added weight to the other side of the ledger where the silence had been winning. They developed rituals. The bottle cap story became a recurring act, a coin-sized moon that promised to glow if you let it rest inside your palm for 3 slow breaths. Lily learned the 3 breaths like a counting game. She drew moons in the margins of her sketches and began to place a page, sometimes on the receptionist's desk, with a little heart cut from a napkin. She practiced saying cap until the word unmoored from pain, and took on the lightness of a game. Ruth told stories the way someone filters light through a glass, careful, intentional, attuned to the variations. She used objects. A coffee stirrer became a wand that pointed out the path between two tiles. A crease in a pamphlet could be folded into a tiny hat. In the evenings, the memory of those small moves lingered in Lily's drawings. The houses with locked doors would, on some pages, show a small ladder propped neatly against a side wall, as if the child had imagined an exit. Benjamin's reactions were not simple. He watched security feeds in fragments, like someone paging through an album. He could not help himself. He counted the minutes Lily had smiled and the minutes she had not. He began to check the cleaning schedule on his way out of meetings, pretending the curiosity was protocol and not the sudden jolt of hope that something unplanned might be working. He noticed the bear more than he noticed Ruth. The button eye had a raggedness that spoke of a different economy, one that measured value by necessity rather than by line items. Once, he rode the elevator down without announcing it, telling his assistant that he had a meeting on the ground floor. He walked the path that security cameras watched from above and saw Ruth and Lily at the base of the pillar, their heads bent near each other like conspirators. He stood at a distance like a man looking through glass, at a thing he wanted to understand by observation alone. When he approached, the conversation was succinct. "She doesn't speak much," he said, folding his hands. "No," Ruth replied, and she did not elaborate. She had the economy of those who had been asked too many questions, and learned that silence did not mean a blank beyond which curiosity could not be fed, but that some things unraveled only when given room. "So what do you do?" Benjamin asked, because a man like him framed the world by occupation. Ruth answered with the truth she had learned to carry as a kind of armor. "I clean." He looked at her hands, perhaps expecting them to be rough with chemicals and steel wool. Instead, they were patient-paged hands, the kind that had once held a chalk marker and navigated a classroom of 20 children between lessons. Ruth glimpsed what he had not yet said, the recognition in his face that she had been something else before. "I used to teach," she said, "long ago, for a while." Benjamin's question, that quiet, loaded thing, hung between them and then dissolved into the larger question he could not voice aloud. What had ailed his daughter that charts and curricula could not mend? Why did a woman with no title and no credential seem to find the seam where Lily's silence was stitched shut? There were practicalities he could not ignore. A CEO does not wield power without noticing its consequences. Company policies existed for reasons. The contractors who managed the cleaning staff had their own thresholds for engagement. Insurers had clauses that were more often read like incantations than explanations. The board had a tone and a temper. Investors read headlines and headlines read numbers. If a stray interaction led to a misunderstanding, it could be twisted. Benjamin had learned to calculate risk in decimals. Still, when he left that day, he carried the image of Lily with a small bear against her chest. It lodged in his teeth like a bitter herb, necessary and discomforting. If stories like this move you, and you believe people who are unseen deserve to be seen, tap subscribe to keep listening to human journeys that remind us of what patience and presence can do. The early weeks were a montage of small recoveries, not a miracle, never that, but a slow accrual, as if the world were a vessel that could hold a little more light when small hands rearranged the contents. Lily began to bring crayons and left drawings on the reception desk with the sort of intention that suggested she had learned the map of corridors where human kindness still passed. Ruth taught her a ritual. When you felt an ache that sat heavy in your chest, you traced 3 lines on a paper and then folded it into a small square. It was neither therapy nor a doctrine. It was the reclamation of a gesture. Lily kept a collection of those folded squares in the back of her sketchbook like a private harvest. Ruth's backstory was not absent of shadow. She had been a teacher once, with a classroom that smelled of glue and sun-warm paper, with a son named Elijah who could split a room into laughter and light. The fire that took him away did not require detail to be heavy. The grief itself did not fit into a headline. Ruth carried it like a pocket of cold that never entirely melted, and within that cold there was an ember she tended, the belief that stories could sometimes be handed over like tools. She did not say she was a hero. Heroes in books wore capes and fixed what happened to be broken. Ruth offered small repairs, stitches that would hold only if tended. She kept to her terms. She would not insinuate herself into therapy sessions or into the child's bedroom at night. She came at appointed hours, kept the rituals simple, and left before the building's lights dimmed. When Benjamin once offered to pay her more, to hire someone to formalize what she was doing, she declined. Money could not buy the rhythm she had cultivated, any more than a photograph could capture the warmth of tea poured from a chipped thermos. She set boundaries because she had learned they were the only reliable way to stay, after loss, without being swallowed. The quieter the lobby grew, the clearer the small resistances of the institution became. A staffing firm ran the cleaning crew as efficiently as a factory ran a line. They had metrics for mop cycles, for cloth inventory, for hours billed. They did not have a ledger for the way a child stopped drawing houses with closed doors. The company's HR director, a woman named Elaine, who took comfort in policies the way some people took comfort in recipes, narrated risk in a calm voice. "It's a liability issue," she told Benjamin, in a meeting that smelled of coffee and linen. "Unsupervised adult contact with employees' children. Investors worry about perception. We must standardize interactions." Across the table, an investor's representative looked at a spreadsheet and then at Lily, in a photograph Benjamin had brought along, because he could not bring an image of what he was trying to protect. The representative pushed up his glasses and said, as if reciting from the playbook of potential disasters, "This sets a precedent." "There's an effect," Benjamin said, and his voice had the edge of someone standing at a viewpoint and seeing both the cliff and the garden below. He did not yet have the language for how a janitor's stories had percolated into a child's drawings, how the bottle cap ritual had made Lily count breaths, how the bear had, in small increments, asked the world to notice what it had not. Elaine's voice softened, because that was her form of discipline. "We can create guidelines, we can have supervised activities, we can consult with our advisors to make sure the company is protected." "Or," Benjamin replied, feeling the edge of a decision twist in his chest, "we can listen. Sometimes protection becomes a reason not to feel." If there had been a single moment to make him step back into the ledger and its margins, this might have been it. Institutional arguments are persuasive in their own architecture. They make neat rooms where human mess would otherwise be unwelcome. Investors, too, were not villains. One of them, an older woman who had built her own company from a garage and who watched Ruth's little tableau play out with the grim patience of someone who'd seen a lot, said simply, "We should be careful." Her tone meant, "I understand caution, but do not mistake it for moral superiority." The building itself absorbed these debates with the patience of stone. Its elevators continued to run, its light continued to cut sharp angles, but problems do not stop at the edge of policy. They seep around it. Word spread in the pattern of small things. A lunchroom conversation, a whispered compliment at the cafe, a child in a nearby office who had once found courage in Ruth's stories and now smoothed a napkin into a boat for someone else. The janitor's presence was a kind of contagion, the benign, hopeful kind that makes people loosen the edge of their shoulders. Still, the cleaning firm's counsel was clear. If it became known that employees' children were interacting with cleaning staff in unsanctioned ways, there were willful misunderstandings waiting to be made. A photographer from a local paper could misframe a moment and make it a scandal overnight. The city is always hungry for a story with the right cut. That potential made the investor's brows knit. Benjamin found himself at a crossroads, not because he was a man who had never made hard choices. He had made many, but because this choice forced him into a moral grammar that lacked accounting lines. He could create bureaucracy around compassion and sanitize it until it was recognizable to every board member. Or he could accept that sometimes the only thing money could not calibrate was the shape of someone's attention. To make a public decision would mean he had to carry both the praise and the criticism. He had to choose whether the dignity of a person like Ruth mattered enough to risk corporate discomfort. Ruth, for her part, kept the work visible but not performative. She did not decorate her cart in a way that demanded notice. She did not post photos of Lily on a social feed. Her evidence existed in the piling of folded squares in a sketchbook, and in the way the security guard now winked when he saw her approach. When a member of the cleaning firm called her in for a talk about time allocation and roles, she listened, and she spoke with a firmness she rarely used. "I am here to do my job," she told the supervisor, "but I am also me." That phrasing, "I am also me," did more than 1,000 documents. It nudged at a truth that bureaucracy avoids. People are not singular functions. They are histories. Ruth had other parts. She was a mother who had built forts from pallets for a boy whose name kept returning like a refrain. She kept a small photograph inside the thermos lid, a picture of Elijah with a gap-toothed grin. It was private, and it was the explanation of why she carried a bear that had been mended a dozen times. The day the contractor's manager wrote an email proposing clarified boundaries felt like a gust through a window that had been shut for a long time. The language was polite, legal, and wrapped around the shape of caution. Benjamin read it and felt the ledger tilt. He called an emergency meeting with Elaine and the investor liaison. The phrase precedent-setting arrived again, like a legal bird perching on a ledge. "There are other ways to ensure oversight," Benjamin said, and his voice was quiet because he knew how quietness could sound like resolve when used sparingly. "We need to think about the child's needs first." "And we do," Elaine replied. "But we also need to think of thousands of stakeholders. If anything goes wrong, we are not just responsible for one child." The investor's representative folded his hands. "You know what the headlines do," she said. "They turn a private moment into a public argument." Benjamin thought of Lily pressing her thumb to a line in a drawing and looking up as if searching for proof that someone else had seen what she had made. He thought of a woman who had been taught to hide and who, with the gentleness of a practice, found ways to unhide. He kept his decision like a coin in his pocket, flipping it between his fingers until it warmed. At home that night, Benjamin stared at a photograph of his wife and at a child's drawing pinned to the fridge, a shaky house with a ladder against the side. He could draw a line through a company's balance sheet, he could quantify risk, reorder resources. But there was a cost to safety too. It could become a strategy that buys peace at the price of compassion. Ruth kept her distance from the conversation, not because she was uninterested, but because she had a wisdom about power. To accept its notice is sometimes to give it power over you. She preferred the slow art of returning. When a supervisor suggested she formalize the interaction into a program, she did not immediately say yes. She wanted the time to think, to set conditions, to make sure that whatever shape it took would not be the kind of thing that extinguished what had started. Lily, in her way, showed the first reckonings of hope. She left a folded square on the receptionist's desk that read in her careful block letters, "For Ruth." It was both a gift and a claim. When Ruth found it, she smiled with a softness that had been reserved for late-night prayers and small harvests. She put the square inside her thermos like a token. The tension tightened. Benjamin started to see the company not just as a machine, but as a place that could choose a shape. He imagined calling the contractor and saying bluntly that he wanted a different arrangement. He imagined public memos that would have to be written, careful language that turned human nuance into policy. Those memos would be scrutinized. They would be read by people who loved the safety of rules and feared the risk of appearances. One evening, after a meeting that left him raw, Benjamin went down to the lobby with the unsleek need of a man who wanted to observe without being observed. He stood by the pillar and watched Ruth braid a paper napkin in the shape of a ladder for Lily. The little gesture, humble and exact, cut through his defenses like a blade. He felt the weight of his title and the fragility of his daughter's emerging smiles jostle against each other until he could not tell which was heavier. There was a knock on his office door the next morning. It was the kind of knock that preceded official interventions. HR had drafted a memo, the contractor had prepared documentation, the investor had sent another note emphasizing due diligence. They did not mean harm. They meant to preserve a system whose rules had been the scaffolding of their success. He sat at the desk and read their words. Somewhere in the phrasing, he heard the building's logic, a logic that had always preferred the measurable to the messy. And yet, too, he felt the presence of a child whose lips had begun to shape a word. It was more than a policy question. It had become for him a moral test. Benjamin could have done the neat and expected thing, adopt the language, write the memo, delegate. Instead, he found himself tracing the line of the bear's button with his thumb, an absent gesture he could not explain. He stood, pulled his coat on, and walked down to the lobby. He did not tell Ruth that he was there because he had an idea. He simply sat at the edge of the space where she worked and watched her explain to Lily, this time with a story about how a little moon found its way home, that sometimes the world looked like wet cement, but that the cap could still roll. He felt the magnetism of ordinary tenderness working on him. What he decided was not yet a manifesto. It was a movement inward, a refusal of the neatness of policy to swallow a human thing whole. He was aware the choice would ripple. It could invite praise or criticism, or both. It could alter how the board thought of him. But watching Ruth fold a napkin into a ladder, a vision of what he wanted to build emerged. Not a program designed by consultants, but a small structure that prioritized presence over optics. Before he said anything, he walked up to Ruth and extended his hand in the kind of gesture that might have once been the precursor to a formal employment offer. "Ruth," he said, his voice stripped of its usual armor, "would you come to a meeting? I want to hear what you think." Ruth looked at him. The look was not suspicion, it was the careful weighing of someone who had learned that offers often came with strings. "I will come," she said, "but I will not trade my time for a title." The statement landed in Benjamin like a note that required reading between the lines. He heard it, and also heard the deeper insistence, not to be used as an image, not to have the very thing that was proving saving, her autonomy, co-opted by corporate frames. It was a modest condition and a gust of honest air. He did not promise that evening. He simply scheduled a time and left the conversation with the sense that a small revolution was possible within the margins of a policy memo. But the firefight had already begun quietly in email chains and in the corners of a boardroom where people who had not yet seen a child smile again gathered to talk about precedent. Ruth went home that night and poured tea. She opened her thermos and took out the photograph tucked in its lid. Elijah's face looked back at her, unchanged. There were nights when the photograph would make the room ache like a bruise. Other nights it warmed her the way a familiar song will. She put the photo away and set the bear on her bed, smoothing its threadbare paw with a practiced thumb. Lily sat at the reception desk and drew a house with a window that had shutters opened wide. For the first time in months, she added a small ladder on the outside. The ladder was not perfect. Its rungs were uneven, but it existed. The chapter of negotiations had begun. The cleaning contract had clauses with the kind of language that loved certainty. The investor had fears that loved headlines. HR had a ledger of risks. And in the center of this ordered world stood three people who did not fit neatly into lines. Ruth, a woman who wore the weight of grief like a coat. Lily, a child in the slow work of learning how to speak again. Benjamin, a man used to the virtue of numbers who wanted to learn the virtue of attention. At dusk, Benjamin stood in the lobby and watched Lily trace the ladder on her paper. He imagined making a memo that would say one thing and do another. He imagined a program named after someone he loved. He worried about optics. He feared the kind of bureaucratization that would squeeze the life out of what was alive. And yet he found himself thinking, unexpectedly, about a way to protect both the child and what was working. He thought of creating a small initiative that had guardrails, but not the heavy-handedness of a campaign manual. He wanted something that could honor the person who had done the hard, invisible work without turning her into a spectacle. The choice was a hinge. It was not a finality. It was an invitation to a different practice of leadership. The board would have to be convinced, investors would have to be eased, and HR would have to write words that balanced freedom and oversight. None of that could be done in private, and none of it would be without friction. Ruth sensed the change because people noticed tide shifts in the patterns of footsteps. She kept returning because she had learned how to be a small tide in a large sea. She did not ask to be the hero of any story. She did ask to be seen as a whole human being. The bear she kept in her pocket was not an emblem. It was a map of tenderness that had been mended and mended again. Inside her pocket, the bear's stitching had begun to come loose again. She paused in the doorway of the cafe and ran her thumb along a seam, as if smoothing a wrinkle in an old map. She inhaled the smell of coffee and warmed milk and the faint sweetness of bakery sugar. The world outside the lobby, the city, the sky like wet cement, continued to press on its own troubles. Down the corridor, a supervisor prepared a memo. The investor drafted an email. HR scheduled a meeting. Those were the noises of an institution doing what institutions do, trying to fit human mess into designed shapes. They were not in themselves malevolent. They were often default responses. Ruth, Lily, and Benjamin moved through that noise like three small instruments trying to find harmony in a room of well-tuned machines. One of them was learning to speak again. One of them had learned the craft of listening in ways no training manual could teach. One of them had been given the responsibility to choose how to hold both gentle acts and corporate reality. Around them the building breathed, indifferent and absorbing. The marble kept its cool face. The ficus continued to hold its leaves. For now, the story was less about pronouncements and more about small accumulations, folded squares, bottle-cap moons, ladders drawn in a child's hand. Those things settled into a pattern that felt hopeful because it did not promise too much. But patterns invite inquiry, and inquiry would demand answers. The next morning, a memo arrived in Benjamin's inbox with a subject line that made the pit of his stomach tighten. Clarification of third-party staff interactions. It was written with all the soft cruelty of policies, precise, unemotional, and pointing to categories where humans get lost. Attached were the legal team's notes, the contractor's justification, and a set of recommended actions. He read it twice. Then he walked down to the lobby and found Ruth sweeping a line along the base of a pillar, the broom a soft metronome. Lily sat on the floor nearby, coloring an open window. Benjamin cleared his throat. "We need to talk," he said. Ruth looked up, wiped her hands on her apron, and set the broom with that exacting economy of someone who always kept tools in order. "I know," she said. "They sent a memo." He hesitated, and the hesitancy felt like a small thing and a large one, both. "They said clarification," he said. "But I think—" He stopped because the sentence contained more than a policy would let him say. Ruth's eyes were gentle but principled. If they want clarification, they should ask us, not write a letter that says we are problems. Benjamin nodded. The word problems had a heaviness to it that did not belong to children or to people doing small acts of care. He made a decision in the space between two breaths. It was not declarative yet. It was the first scheduling of a will to act. He took out his phone, opened his calendar, and booked a meeting titled simply, Listening Session. He invited HR and the contractor and a few board members. He added Ruth with a note that said, "I want to hear from you." Ruth read the invitation and considered it the way someone would consider a window left open on a winter night. She could step into warm air and risk drafts. She could refuse and remain small and unappreciated. Or she could go and speak, set conditions, insist on a voice that was not an ornament in policy. She accepted. She wrote back, brief, "I will come. I will speak only for what I know. I won't be anyone's show." Benjamin felt relief and a prickle of fear at once. He knew inviting her into a room with HR and a contractor meant exposing her to institutionalized formalities that flattened nuance. He also knew avoiding the room would be worse. It would cede the conversation to policy writers who would speak for the people in their margins. The day of the meeting approached like the weather changes, incrementally, with clouds that hinted at rain. People began to form opinions about the soundness of caution. The investor sent a private note suggesting that any deviation from standard procedure required a pilot study. Elaine prepared talking points about liability. The contractor pulled together a list of best practices that read like a checklist for emotional hygiene. Ruth walked into the glassed conference room with the quiet that belongs to people who have been seen to their edges and have kept standing. Lily stayed with Marta at the cafe, colouring a ladder on a napkin and then tucking it into her pocket like a talisman. On the table, the bear's button eye would be a small thing. The ladder would be a small thing. The memo would be a small thing. It was the place where small things confronted policy that mattered. The conversation that followed would not be tidy. It would ask questions that could not be answered in one meeting. It would require Benjamin to practice being a leader who let listening come before approval. It would also force Ruth to name boundaries and for HR to practice the rare skill of hearing human testimony without immediately translating it into checkboxes. They gathered around the table knowing that whatever they agreed to would ripple outward, through contracts, into the pages of investor memos, and into the everyday lives of people who came to the building and breathed the air. The stakes were not only for Lily. They were about what kind of company Carter Labs wanted to be, one that reduced humans to functions, or one that recognized the dignity of the quiet things that keep a world together. The first part of that conversation had begun the moment Ruth stepped into the lobby with a cart, a bear, and a handful of stories. It had been a slow arc, from a threadbare toy on cool marble to a company dialoguing about the shape of compassion. The rest of the arc would ask more of everyone involved. When the meeting began, each person carried their own ledger in their pockets, rules, fears, hopes, past losses, woven into the way they framed questions and answers. None of them could have said, at that moment, how the negotiation would land. But they all knew the room contained more than the sum of its memos. It contained people, and that would, in a way that no policy sheet could prevent, matter. The conference room felt cool and precise, the kind of cool that made soft things feel louder. Glass walls held the city at bay, while a dozen people sat around a table stacked with printed notes and polite intentions. Elaine folded her hands the way she folded policy, neat, measured. The contractor's manager had a folder of procedures that looked like armor. The investor liaison had the patience of someone who had seen many storms and preferred to ride them from a window seat. Ruth sat with her thermos between her knees and the bear folded into her coat. She spoke without theater. She spoke in short sentences that carried weight because they came from a life that had been lived rather than from a training manual. "I sit," she said, "and I tell stories. I make small things. I don't go places I'm not invited. I won't be a poster for the company. I won't have my time sold as charity. If we do something, it should let people keep their dignity." Her phrases were simple. They landed like stones dropped into a pond. Faces around the table shifted with the ripple. Elaine asked about oversight. The contractor's manager raised questions about scheduling. The investor wanted assurances about precedent and public image. Benjamin listened. He had called the meeting not to impose an answer, but to practice a difficult kind of stewardship, to let something human be heard before it was folded into a memo. "There will be concerns," he said finally. "We should address them. But let's start with what is working. People are recovering small pieces of their lives. A child is drawing a ladder again. An adult is no longer invisible." The older investor, the woman who had made companies from grit, leaned forward. She had watched Ruth and Lily through a glass for weeks. Her voice was younger than her years because it wore certain practicalities like jewelry. "This could be done badly," she said. "It could be a press photo or a stunt. It could be used to sell the company, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a real thing, small, consistent. If you're willing to carry the risk, then make sure it's honest." Benjamin's decision was not the absence of fear. It was the presence of a different fear, the quiet one that asked him how he would feel if he had chosen safety and noticed later that safety looked like a wall around his daughter's world. He thought of Lily's thumb tracing a moon in the margin of a drawing. He thought of Ruth's hand making a tiny ladder from a napkin. He asked Elaine to draw up a proposal that would protect children without sterilizing the care. He asked the contractor to be part of a pilot. He asked the investor to allow a trial period. He asked Ruth to set the terms. He asked the board to let him be accountable for the outcome. Privately, the contractor pushed back. "We can't allow unsanctioned interactions," the manager said in a phone call that borrowed the language of risk. "If public perception turns, we will lose more than goodwill." Public perception did not have to be a monolith. It could be shaped by how the people involved behaved. Benjamin decided to take the chance. He called the contractor in and, in a conversation that was careful and clean, told them the company would not extend their contract beyond its present term. The contractors reacted as contractors do. Business decisions mattered. No one was villainous in their objections. They were protecting their revenue and the structure of their obligations. Word spread in the way a building breathes, through staff rooms and whispers and the quiet circulation of tips. Some people praised him. Some called the decision reckless. The newspapers did not have to invent a scandal. Someone within the firm leaked the outline of a pilot, and the city murmured intrigue, but the tone of attention shifted toward what was actually happening in the lobby: a child drawing a ladder and a woman folding squares into a thermos. Benjamin established the Elijah Project not as spectacle, but as a named commitment. He chose the name with private hands. He did not make a show of the grief it honored. He used the name to mark the thing that had been central to Ruth's quiet labor. The project would be small at first. A liaison role filled by Ruth, a modest budget to train staff to notice and respond with humane gestures, a few supervised sessions where children could come to the lobby with parents or guardians and engage in activities that were not clinical but human: drawing, story time, making paper ladders. There were conditions. Ruth insisted on them. She insisted there be no photographs without consent. She wanted no press conferences that would turn people into objects. She asked for a modest stipend that recognized labor for what it was. She asked for boundaries that would protect the rhythms she had cultivated. Benjamin agreed. He asked HR to draft a simple charter that honored those terms without expanding them into chains. The first weeks of the Elijah Project were like tending a small plant. There were mistakes, an overly enthusiastic newsletter that almost made Ruth's face into a logo, and adjustments, clearer language, tighter commitments, an emphasis on consent. The cleaning firm sent a terse goodbye when its contract ended. Their staff were rehired under new management or found work elsewhere. The building's culture adjusted in tiny increments. A security guard, who used to treat children as disruptions, learned to fold a napkin into a fish for a small office boy. A receptionist began keeping an extra box of crayons. The cafe manager kept an extra cup of warm milk. Ruth's role was not glamorous. It involved afternoons at the base of the pillar and evenings of planning, with a small group of volunteer staff who wanted to learn how to pay attention. She taught them how to make a child's 3 breaths count, how to fold a napkin ladder, how to sit without filling a silence with adult talk. She trained volunteers to be steady, to notice rhythms rather than fix them. Lily kept her sketchbook close. The drawings changed in ways that were not always dramatic, but were definite. A house with shutters, a ladder with rungs, a sun with a small cap in the corner. She started to tuck folded squares into pockets for safekeeping. Once, she left a picture on the receptionist's desk that said in block letters, "Ruth helps." That sentence felt like a mile. For Benjamin, the work required him to practice a kind of leadership he had not needed to use before, the practice of holding paradox. He had to speak to investors about return on culture while also making a case that some returns could not be measured in quarters. He had to protect Ruth from becoming a mascot and protect the company from headlines that misunderstood the work. He did not always succeed. He sat through a board meeting where an argument about optics became a small tempest. But he did not give in to the easiest solution. The investor, who had been cautious, watched the project quietly. Slowly, as weeks turned into months, she saw small indicators. A decrease in anonymous complaints about the company's sterility. A number of stories from employees who said their children felt safer coming to work with them on certain days because there was a place their kids could be seen. She did not call these things data in the way analysts would. She called them signs. They mattered. Not everything ran smooth. A local photographer, sensing a human interest angle, tried to get a photograph of Ruth in the lobby. The company blocked the photos until consent was given. Someone leaked a clipped soundbite, and a commentator spun a specious narrative about elites finding virtue in cleaning carts. The story landed with a thud of misunderstanding in some corners, but it also forced the company to double down on its ethical commitments. Benjamin wrote a memo that was short and steady. The Elijah Project existed to provide presence and dignity. Participation required consent. No photos without permission, no commercialization. Ruth continued to refuse hero narratives. When a communications director suggested a public profile piece on the janitor who saved a child, she said no. "I am not a savior," she told them. "I am someone who has learned how to be with people. There are many of us who do this work." That insistence became part of the project's ethos. The Elijah Project was not a campaign. It was a modest network of people, staff, volunteers, a cafe manager, a receptionist, a security guard, who learned to notice. Some executives attended a session and sat in a circle while Ruth told a story about a bottle cap moon. They left with damp eyes and the sense that policy papers could never describe what they had felt in a chair, listening to a woman make small things matter. Lily's reclamation was not linear. There were days when she retreated, closed her sketchbook, and needed only to hold the bear. There were days when she burst into giggles at a napkin bird Ruth made. There were evenings when she found the courage to say a new word and then retracted it, surprised by the sound of herself. The family learned to measure progress in fragments, a shared joke, a new drawing, a sentence offered to a receptionist as if it were a small gift. On a quiet afternoon, 6 months into the project, Lily wandered into the lobby and, without being prompted, sat at the reception desk and asked for a paper and a pencil. Her voice was small. It was not a declaration. It was a step. "I want to draw a ladder," she said. Ruth smiled and handed her a piece of paper. Make it as crooked as you like, she said. Ladders don't have to be straight to work. Lily sketched, and then, while Ruth hummed a lullaby that had the shape of a river in it, she folded the paper into a small square and placed it in Ruth's thermos lid. It was a currency between them. Benjamin watched from the stairwell. He felt the shape of a private relief, that sometimes the right thing felt like a choice rather than a risk. He also felt the public weight of having chosen a path that some would call risky. He had not solved the problem of headlines. He had instead decided that some risks were worth holding. Ruth began to meet with other staff who wanted to learn the skill of noticing without fixing. She taught them how to hold a child's silence and how to make space for a small ritual. She told the story of Elijah sometimes, in the way that a person might give a reason for an action without asking for pity. When I lost him, she would say, I learned how small things are important. They add up. In those sessions, staff members told their own stories. A receptionist spoke of a father who smelled like the sea and had never learned to carry tenderness. A security guard admitted he had once thought of children at work as distractions and now made paperfish for them. The project did not only touch Lily, it started a ripple that altered how many people, the cafeteria staff, the cleaning team, the mailroom clerks, saw the building as a place for more than transactions. Not every senior executive understood the softness of the work. Some remained suspicious. One of them called the initiative well-intentioned but unfocused. Another wanted metrics. Benjamin responded with patience and with examples. A receptionist who said the initiative had saved her job because a child who once threw tantrums now sat at her desk and drew while a parent completed a meeting. An intern who spoke about how seeing care, given by someone not paid to perform it, had changed how she imagined generosity. The company published a small internal report after the first year. It was not a glossy pamphlet with statistics meant to arm marketers. It was a careful narrative of changes, tiny testimonies, a number of supervised sessions held, consent forms signed, and the stories of staff whose days had become less brittle. The language was modest and honest. It did not pretend to empirical bravery. It simply recorded that small things had shifted. A year after Ruth first sat by the pillar, the company organized a modest gathering in the atrium. No balloons, no press rows, just a circle of chairs and a pot of coffee. They called it the Elijah Day, a day to remember small acts. Ruth would speak if she wished, and there would be people who had been in the small network of care. Ruth thought about what to say. Public speaking had been a closed door for much of her life. She had taught children for years, and then stepped away into a grief that had taught her silence. Now she considered words like a person might consider mending a sweater, carefully, stitch by stitch. On the morning of the gathering, Lily arrived early. Her hair was braided with a loose ribbon, and she carried a sketchbook that had a new thickness to its pages. She had left several folded squares inside the thermos lid, as if offering them as luck. Benjamin stood near the doorway, a man who had learned to let decisions be both personal and public. The audience was a mixture. A few board members, some staff, volunteers, Marta the cafe manager, the security guard who whistled, and the older investor who had watched the whole arc with a steady hand. There were also a handful of parents whose children had participated in supervised sessions. Cameras were not invited. Ruth approached the small podium and cleared her throat. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected and stronger for that quiet. She did not read a script. She spoke as someone who had lived in rooms with too much noise and had learned to let a single voice be enough. I don't want to make myself larger than I am, she began. I used to teach. I had a boy named Elijah who could make the room laugh. After he was gone, the world felt like someone had taken the color out of a painting. I learned that small things matter. I learned to fold paper into ladders. I learned how to sit. She looked at Lily, who watched her with a concentration that made the room breathe in. A child taught me how to keep living in the company of grief, Ruth said. She didn't ask for lessons. She asked for time. Her words were simple. They were not written to persuade a market or to be shared as a quote. They were the honest speech one human offers to another. "I am not a hero," she said, and the sentence carried no false modesty. "I am someone who has kept coming. There are many people who keep coming. The work we do is not to fix people or to be on a billboard. It is to let people know they are not alone." Benjamin watched the audience. Some faces were shiny with tears. The older investor wiped an eye discreetly. A receptionist folded a small napkin and kept it in her pocket. The applause, when it came, was gentle and real. After the speech, Lily climbed up on a small step and handed Ruth a drawing. It was a house with a ladder and a sun with a cap. At the bottom, in careful letters, Lily had written, "For Ruth, thank you." The room laughed softly, and then, because laughter loosens things, it applauded again. Ruth's terms had held. She had accepted pay that meant she could leave the cleaning firm and not lose her stability. She had kept the right to refuse photos. She had moved into a modest office that she used mostly to assemble materials and to meet with volunteers. She kept her cart. The cart was a kind of emblem, not a symbol of past anonymity, but a sign of continuity. Sometimes she swept the corner of the lobby because the motion was meditative. Others swept too, not because they had to, but because they wanted to share a habit. The Elijah Project continued to be small and patient. It did not scale overnight into a national model. It scaled into relationships, a culture shift in a building that spread through example. Other firms asked about the project. They came to listen and to learn, and some adopted pieces of the ethos. But Ruth refused anything that felt like spectacle. She insisted on the quiet covenant, dignity first, publicity second. In time, other janitors and staff who had once been invisible were asked to speak in small panels about what they did. It felt strange to some of them at first, the idea of being visible, but many found it easier than they had feared. A few followed Ruth's approach and taught others to fold ladders, to tell bottle cap stories, to sit with a child's silence. Ruth kept a photograph of Elijah in her thermos, the image worn at the edges. Sometimes she took it out and smoothed the corner with her thumb. She never spoke of the fire in detail. She did not need to. The loss sat in her like an old bruise. It was the explanation of a certain tenderness, not a demand for pity. Benjamin's life felt altered in ways that his meetings could not capture. He started to show up, not to micromanage, but to be present. He learned to listen not only to reports, but to stories. In his office hung a child's drawing of a ladder, framed not as propaganda, but as a reminder. He met with investors who asked hard questions and told them what small goodness he had chosen to protect. Some investors left, others stayed. It was a cost he had been willing to pay. Months became years. Lily's sketchbook grew thick. She started to speak more in the cafeteria, telling a joke here, answering a question there. She sometimes sat on Ruth's lap when a lullaby needed a body to anchor it. She made friends with a girl whose father worked in the mailroom, and with a boy whose mother brought him into the building when she had to work late. Those small interactions accumulated like deposits. One afternoon, toward the end of a long winter, Benjamin found a paper ladder taped to his office door with a note. "For noticing." It was from Lily. He laughed, the sound lost under the hum of the building. It felt like a small absolution. The public recognition that came later was quiet. A local nonprofit nominated the Elijah Project for a small award. A neighborhood paper ran a story that honored the project without turning it into spectacle. People shared the piece because they recognized something true inside it. The world had space for dignity if someone chose to notice. Ruth rarely sought praise. She accepted a small plaque the day the project marked 2 years, a modest thing that sat in the lobby near the pillar. The plaque was not about her. It recorded the project's purpose: to protect space for human presence, to honor the dignity of all workers, and to remember that small acts could be saving. At night, when the lobby emptied and the city light went soft, Ruth would fold one of Lily's squares into a pocket and take out the photograph of Elijah, smoothing its worn corner. Sometimes she hummed the bottle cap song and watched the stitch of the bear's seam. Other nights she would write little notes on the margins of her lesson plans, stories she might tell a group the following week. She had reclaimed a voice that was measured and true. For Benjamin, the smallest moments were the ones he cherished. Not press statements or bored victories, but the time he watched his daughter lean her head against Ruth's shoulder while the three of them waited for an elevator. He had not thought that a man with resources could feel so grateful for someone who had simply held space. Gratitude, he found, was not always about receiving. Sometimes it was about allowing someone else to be whole. On the plaza outside Carter Labs, where the light caught the building's edges like a precise line, Ruth sometimes walked with Lily. People who had not known them before saw them and paused in recognition. It was not celebrity, it was presence. When guests came to the building, security sometimes ushered them through the lobby and paused to tell them about the project's small rituals. "We have a woman," they would say, "who teaches us how to be present." People nodded. Some were moved, some were skeptical. Most, if they stayed long enough, found that the lobby felt different. It had gained small pockets where attention lived. Years later, when the project had become a modest fixture in the building's life, a new father brought his own daughter to a supervised session. He had tears in his eyes and kept thanking Ruth. "She hasn't laughed like this," he said. Ruth only nodded and told him a bottle cap story. Those were the moments that mattered. Not memos or memos avoided, not awards or the occasional headline, but the folding of a napkin into a bird, the quiet handing over of a bear, the drawing of a ladder on the back of a receipt. They accumulated into something that was not flashy, but durable. The last image the building kept, for those who cared to notice, was not of a janitor turned hero in the films of myth. It was of a woman with a cart who had learned to keep coming, a child whose voice had grown in small increments, and a man who chose dignity over the easiest ledger. They were not the only actors in the story, but they had become its shape. On a cool afternoon when lilies were still making ladders in sketchbooks, and Ruth had tucked a small square into her thermos for luck, Benjamin stood in the doorway and watched them. Lily drew a heart at the corner of a page and, without being told, handed the paper to Ruth. Ruth folded it into a square and placed it in the thermos lid, then hugged the bear and smoothed a seam. He walked away then, not because the work was done, no work like that ever was done, but because for once the world had given him a small proof. The person no one noticed had been the one to notice what mattered. If this story moved you, share it with someone who sees the people others overlook. And if you want more stories about small acts that change lives, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next human journey.